Welcome to the show, Seth. It's really nice to see you again. Just to introduce you to people who haven't met you before, this is Seth Engelhard. Um, Seth is a veteran of many companies, including New Relic, GitLab, Netlify, and now you're VP of Engineering at Observable. I have known Seth for a really long time, and I was really looking forward to sitting down and talking about leadership topics. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jade. Yeah, it's good to see you again. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And yeah, like you said, we go back a long way. In fact, it occurs to me you were like one of the first people that I ever met at New Relic. You were, I think, my hiring manager
I think I was.
initially.
Yeah, when I was searching for our notes before we talked here, I actually brought up some old notes from our New Relic days. And
Yeah.
yeah, we go way back.
Cool.
So looking forward to chatting about this. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you about is your time now at Observable, and I guess I was kind of curious about you've been in a lot of different leadership roles, but what was it like for you to transition into being the VP of engineering, like kind of in charge of everything without that kind of safety net that you've had in previous roles?
Yeah, it's been a good transition and definitely like an interesting transition. And I think that there are like aspects of it that I sort of had imagined, but as these things go, still it was a bit of a surprise, right? Once I actually got into it, and I think it's helpful to frame also like where I was coming from was it's a bigger company, still a startup, a bit of bigger startup where I was a director of engineering. And now I am a VP of engineering at Observable, which is much smaller. And so the transition, or I guess like so the differences that really stand out are that I am both sort of, at once I am closer to the code or like the stuff happening on the ground. I'm working with engineers more directly than I was when I was a director of engineering. But also, I'm working much more at the leadership level with my counterparts in the other departments and with our co-CEOs. And so that is just an interesting sort of more than like a split of focus. It's just like these very different levels of that I'm keeping in my head.
That's super interesting because a lot of times people think of like having more responsibility as a very like one-sided thing where your focus is much more at a strategic level or whatever. But sometimes when you're moving into a startup, you're actually just operating at a lot of levels at the same time.
Yeah,
Sounds like.
I think that's true, and I think it would have been a much different experience if I had, moved to be a VP of engineering at a larger company, a similar sized company to where I was before.
Yeah.
Then I would be certainly more distant from, a lot of the stuff that's happening on the ground.
How has it been adjusting to that? Like, was that a surprise for you? Was it a difficult transition?
I think it is what I have found is that it is a little bit hard to hold all of those, to try to balance all those things or hold all of those things, all those different levels sort of in your mind at the same time. And so um, at Observable, we've been really focused on shipping and on, really achieving these short-term sort of tactical goals. And so I know in my head that I should be also focusing on some of like pulling back from that and focusing on strategic stuff as well. But it's hard to do that. It's hard to do that when there's also so much stuff happening. With the team shipping stuff, with the short-term projects, with getting to the next milestone.
I've talked with a lot of heads of engineering in kind of similar situations, and I guess what I've heard a lot is that it's hard to know where to focus your time sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you've dealt with that. Like sometimes it's actually totally appropriate to be focusing very much on the short term and
Mhm.
on execution and everything, and yet you can't totally disregard the long term.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think to be fair, I think it has been probably the right thing to be doing right now at this company. Yeah, that challenge having to decide where to focus my time. It's one of those things, for even from when I moved from being an engineer to being a manager, that I became acutely aware of, right? Suddenly, the the specifics of what I needed to get done or where I needed to be focusing my time weren't as obvious, and it was more up to me to figure that out. And then I think through each transition, that I've had, where I've gone from being a manager to being a director to now a VP of engineering, that I think continues to be the case even more so. And I would say that for the most part in my year and a half at Observable, a lot of my time has been reactive, has been dealing with things as they come in, dealing with challenges, with short-term sort of roadmap goals and slightly longer-term goals. But at the same time, there are points in time, especially as a leadership team, when we try to intentionally take a step back and focus on or spend time defining what that longer term vision is. What is, how are we going to get there? And that's one of the things now that it is the new year that we are attempting to do now.
It sounds like been one of the larger differences between like working at a smaller, earlier stage startup and a later stage startup. And I mean, that sounds pretty appropriate to me. Like when you're earlier stage, you often just need to survive. What other differences have you noticed about like moving to an earlier stage company in a leadership position?
Yeah, I guess this is maybe more of a difference between just being a director or being a VP of engineering. But there is, as a director of engineering at Netlify, I had peers. That was nice. So even if I wasn't working directly with them on projects or, they weren't involved in exactly what I was doing, it was, I had people who were in similar positions who we could bounce ideas off of and strategize together. So certainly that is an aspect that is different and maybe harder about being a VP of engineering. And then similarly, I suppose, as a director of engineering, I had, tons of autonomy for how I managed my team and how we worked and all of that, similar to how I have now. But ultimately, I was not the sole person responsible for all decisions for all of engineering. And if I had concerns or questions or just needed to validate that my the way I was approaching something or my assumptions were correct enough, I could always talk to my VP of engineering, to whom I reported. And so, of course now I do report to somebody, but it's not quite the same thing. I am in charge of engineering. And so those decisions ultimately all do lie with me. And that is, again, it's not something that I couldn't have, foreseen, or is that the right amount of negatives? I don't know. It's something that I had foreseen, but again, is a bit of a surprise, once you're actually in it.
Yeah, I remember for me in my first head of engineering role, that was one of the things that it was hardest, and it was something I expected, but it was maybe a little harder than I anticipated. I felt like I didn't, it kind of felt like going from tight walking, over these high distances with a net under me and tight walking without a net under me. It was just a little bit less, there was less security there, and there was less if I felt a lot more alone in a lot of ways. A lot of times it was like, oh, this is totally on me. And that was a little intimidating sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is an apt metaphor.
Yeah. How have you gone about kind of creating support for yourself, or I think one of the challenges a lot of head of engineering, or really a lot of leaders in general, face is that they don't really have much of a support network or support system.
Mhm.
Have you done anything around that, or have you found that to be challenging?
I have found it to be challenging, and I guess yeah, the things that I've done to try to counter that, I guess there are two main things that I can think of. One is that I have tried to build strong relationships with the other sort of heads of departments, within the company, and so I meet with them, with each of those people, pretty regularly, and there are certain things, if they aren't like engineering specific, but there are many things that I can bounce off of them and sort of, sanity check, get advice, that sort of thing, and vice versa. And then outside of that, I have couple of other people, left Netlify and became VPs of engineering at small companies, just like me. And so there are these two people who used to be my peers at Netlify and are now in a similar position to me. And so we meet regularly, and that's been really useful. And then I guess one additional thing that I'll say is I do belong to, a couple of Slack communities of engineering leaders. And so while I wouldn't say that I have sort of, I don't have the same level of relationships with people necessarily on those platforms, it is a good place to have discussions and to follow along on discussions that are about, topics that are relevant to me, which again, like within my company, isn't necessarily going to happen as much.
Brilliant. That's basically all the things that I recommend to
Oh,
people
good.
when they're that's really great.
Yeah.
I love that. Um, so you've worked at some pretty interesting companies, and one of those is probably the most famous for being remote and async by default, which is GitLab. And I'm always curious talking with somebody that has been at a company that kind of goes really far in a particular direction, because it seems like there's a lot to be learned from that experience. And so I'm kind of curious, like what you personally took from your time at GitLab, and how did you decide what parts of that work culture you wanted to bring into your own leadership and what you wanted to leave behind?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, GitLab was an amazing experience. I learned a ton there, and I'll say I was there from 2018 to 2020. So I can speak to what it was like then. I don't know exactly what it's like now, uh, but at the time, I went from only ever having worked in person in an office to working at GitLab all remote. That was one of the challenges I was excited about, and the way that GitLab was organized, it was very globally distributed, more so than any other company I've worked at, and therefore also very async. And then really it was the way that like the workflows and the communication were organized. It was built sort of on like the model of people working on an open source project all around the world. So very asynchronous. Everything was a GitLab issue. Almost everything was public, like public to the world. There were very few things, at least when I was there, that were private, that weren't exposed entirely to the world. And so there were a lot of really, like you said, they sort of go to the extreme. I think with async and with transparency, and certainly the way that they approach remote work. And there were a lot of things that I really liked about that. One was the fact that there's the handbook as the source of truth that everybody in the company was 100% bought into, and if there was a disagreement between what the handbook said and what somebody thought the real answer was, well, either the handbook is right or it needs to be updated, and now that's the real answer. And so that approach I really liked, and it's something that I have tried to recreate in the places that I've been, but it's hard to do from, it's hard to establish that in a culture that doesn't already have it, I have found. Um, the sort of radical transparency also that GitLab had was really unique and beneficial in ways that, I don't know, I guess didn't seem obvious to me prior to that. I think that by doing so, the leadership and Sid, the CEO in particular, challenged a lot of like long held assumptions about what, like, why, private startups can't be transparent, that like, if people know your plans, if people know what you're building and how and why, then you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage. And that very much, I mean, perhaps there's some truth to that, but at least in GitLab, it felt like the benefits of having everything completely transparent, not having silos or secrets sort of within the company or outside of it, really helped everybody feel in the know, feel confident, feel enabled to do their work, because they can always go find the piece of information that they want. They don't have to ask and wait and wonder if they're getting the whole answer. So that was really cool, and it's something that that I have also tried to advocate for and perpetuate in the companies I've been at since. But again, like that level of radical transparency is pretty radical and not something that I think you can switch to very easily.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there were other things just about I think that like the way that things ran at GitLab and the way that the culture was by the time I got there was very much because from the top down, there was a very strong opinion, and it wasn't just do as I say. It was also do as I do. And so from the top down, there was that transparency. There was that commitment to, the single source of truth, and also a bunch of other, pieces that I haven't mentioned, like the fact that meetings start on time. All meetings are recorded. Generally, those recordings are made public, just put on YouTube. Every meeting has an agenda that is filled out beforehand, and people actually read the agenda and respond to it. And that's sort of a cultural thing that was a norm there, which again is something that I feel like is hard to establish if it hasn't already been and if it's not coming from the top down. So yeah, those are, I'm sure there are many other things, but those are a few of the highlights that stick out to me.
One of the things you're mentioning is kind of the difficulty of applying that without like kind of having it come from the top down and having it really be baked into the culture. I have found that as well. Like the handbook approach was something we did with a lighter touch, but a similar way within engineering at New Relic. And I've had similar experiences of pushing for that and doing that within engineering organizations. And it seems like it would be hard to do a lot of these practices without a pretty tremendous amount of work unless there was widespread agreement from the CEO down. What has been your, like, how far have you gone with these practices? Which ones did you adopt? Which ones did you, how far did you go?
So I would say that with the transparency, I mean, I haven't tried, I don't think, to convince any companies I've been at that we should be putting our meetings on YouTube, but I have advocated for transparency within the company, fewer private channels, fewer documents that are locked down for like no particularly good reason. And so that has been, somewhat successful. I think it depends. It depends on the culture. It depends on the people. But sometimes there is sort of a default to like private first and then public. And sometimes, a lot of times it's for well, intentioned reasons, not to make things too noisy for people who don't need to know about this yet, that sort of thing. But I think that despite those reasons, it's still more beneficial to have that stuff available if somebody wants to be able to reference it, or if you want to send a link to somebody. So that's one that I have tried to perpetuate somewhat. I think the async part of the way that GitLab worked, which I didn't really talk about as much earlier, but heavy written culture, writing and reading, not a lot of meetings because everybody's so globally distributed. And there were things that I really liked about that, and there were things that I missed about talking to people. And so since then, the companies that I've worked at haven't been as distributed. Netlify had a pretty like, maybe not a good split. There were still more people in the US time zones, but there was a good portion of the company in the European time zones, but not really in APAC. So it wasn't really spanning, 24-hour time zones. So we had more overlap and more ability to work synchronously and to have that overlap, have that time to work together. And so there are good practices that come from working async that I think are important no matter what, like making sure that you're writing things down, making sure that when you write an issue, you are adding enough context that somebody besides you reading it, understands what it's about. And so I do try to instill those practices, but overall, I'm not trying to make everybody work async in places where that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's kind of trade-offs to both approaches, and like there's some disadvantages to async as well. And
yeah,
so it kind of goes both ways. That's interesting. So when you look at the companies you've worked at, what have you kind of learned from Netlify or New Relic or GitLab? I mean, you've mentioned some of the things you've taken from GitLab. What about other places you've worked, like Netlify and New Relic?
Yeah. So New Relic, during most of my time there, Bjorn was in charge, as you were there as well, of engineering, product and engineering. And one of the things that I really appreciated about his leadership was how I guess intentional and opinionated he was about certain aspects of how we worked and how the organization operated. Not in a micromanagey way, not like telling specific teams what to do or what they should be working on or how they should work necessarily, but as a whole, as the culture within product and engineering.
He was very prescriptive about how some things were to be done.
Right.
And yeah.
So there were certain things that I really appreciated, like meetings starting and ending on time, which of course, we were all working in an office, and that was, it was helpful, not just because it was respectful of people's time, and people are adults, they should be able to be there on time. But also because there were, limited number of meeting rooms, and certainly almost certainly when your meeting was scheduled to be done at 1:30, there was somebody ready to come in there at 1:30. And if everybody starts running a few minutes late, then that just cascades. So there were practical reasons for that. But because that was something that he emphasized and sort of pushed so strongly, that was a part of the culture. If you weren't there on the minute when it started, then you've missed some of the meeting, and that is not anybody else's fault. That is not up to the people running the meeting. So I appreciated that. Another thing I think, and this is less, I guess it's still, it's part of this sort of intentional culture. When I started at New Relic, it was in sort of the heyday of the early 2010s where companies were building all sorts of elaborate offices with all sorts of toys and ping pong tables and, arcade machines and bars and stuff. And New Relic, had when I started had just built a brand new amazing office in Portland, and the way that Bjorn had decided to spend that money to build out this office was to make it exceptional for working and collaborating. And so there was a lot of thought put into the way it was laid out, to places, specific like physical places where people could collaborate, where people could stand, where people could sit and meet. And, like snacks and all that stuff, of course, but not, he felt strongly that work, work should be work, and then play should be up to you. That should be on your time. And so let's all be here, for the workday. Let's not stay late either. Let's be here for the workday, and then you go and if you want to keep spending time with your coworkers, you can go do that. But we're not expecting you to be here until 9 or 10, sort of playing ping pong and or working. So I appreciated that approach as well, and I think that I would say that in the companies that I've worked at since then, have actually taken a similar approach, which I appreciate.
Yeah, I think that was something that I really appreciated about Bjorn. Like, he was willing to be kind of unreasonably prescriptive about how people do things, about stuff that I don't think I've seen any other engineering leader focus on. Like stuff like how you conduct a meeting. There were I remember him telling us how to treat the remote people on the television, how to sit close to the camera so that, everybody felt closer to each other. Put your laptops down so that there's no barrier between each other.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just drilled into us to the point where it was like that there was a way of doing it. And I don't think I've ever worked with another leader that's been so focused on some of those details about how we communicate, or how we the communication also, he would edit our status updates and critique them and train us to write good status updates so that we knew how to communicate what was going on. And that was maybe a little micromanagey, but I think we all benefited from it.
Yeah.
And we kind of hated it at the same time, but it was, you knew he was doing it for a really good reason.
Yeah. It reminds me of one other thing that he did, which is, again, it's something that I feel like I've heard many engineering leaders say, which is you should go home at the end of the workday. It benefits you and it benefits the company for you to have downtime and to come back refreshed. But Bjorn took it so far as to say people should be gone from the office by 6 p.m. And I forget, it might've been, I think it was 6 when all the lights in the office were programmed to flash a couple times to remind anybody who is still there that it is time to go home. And it's just one of those things that I feel like, again, most people I think will say that, but most people aren't going to go so far as to try to enforce it,
Yeah. Yeah, he was really good about that, and just making sure that there were kind of mechanisms in place to reinforce anything that he was. I would say intentional is the word I would use to describe him if I was going to use any word. I think you used that earlier.
Yep.
What about Netlify? What were some things that you thought were interesting about the work culture there?
Yeah, at Netlify, after coming from GitLab, where it was very asynchronous, that was my first experience with remote. So at that point, my only experience. And coming to Netlify, I was met with the I guess contrast of having more synchronous time with people, which meant more meetings, more Zoom calls, and so forth. But I think that I would say that it helped build, camaraderie more so. Another thing that I appreciated always about Netlify was, I guess, maybe the vulnerability of like the most senior leaders, the CEO, and so forth, where, when they would talk to the company, they came across as very genuine and very, like aware of what was happening in the world at the time. And, just willing to acknowledge that and be open and vulnerable about how these things are hard for them as well. And I think it's something that I think many CEOs do try to do, but sometimes it doesn't actually feel genuine, maybe. And in this case, it did, and I appreciated that. And so I think that is another one of those things that sort of, they were setting an example, and that cascades down. And so as a whole, I think the culture at Netlify really valued, authenticity and everybody being able to bring their whole selves, I guess, to work. So I appreciated that. I think there were other things that we did at Netlify which were similar to GitLab and to New Relic. And part of that is because some of the same people have worked at those places. But, I guess we tried to have the handbook be the source of truth, though again, we weren't able to accomplish that to the same level that GitLab was, where it was really company-wide. Meetings, again, starting on time, making sure there are agendas that are filled out in advance for those meetings. That was something that also was a norm of the culture at Netlify. And for part of my time there, for I guess the majority of my time there, I worked under Dana Lawson, who also had learned from Bjorn and also has her own,
she's great.
Amazing approach to leadership. So I was able to learn a lot from her. Again, sort of along those lines of being authentic and human, I guess.
When you look at your own leadership nowadays, do you have any sort of practices or approaches that you feel like are a little bit non-standard, or kind of you feel you've kind of made up?
I can't think of anything that I would say I've invented. I think that I have certainly pulled many things from many different places and implemented them in ways that hopefully make sense for where I'm at. So again, not unique necessarily, but one of the things I try to do is to, especially in a remote environment, touch base with everybody I work with on a pretty regular basis. So that means, all of the engineers that report to me, I have regular one-on-ones with them. It used to be weekly, and that was something I did have to dial back at one point. So now it is bi-weekly. And then same thing with my counterparts, in other departments. It's a small company, so it is possible to sort of reach everybody. But I think that having that face-to-face time, even when it is virtual, is really, really critical in a remote company. And then I guess, my approach to the engineering process, I would describe as, non-denominational agile, which is to say, I have worked in all sorts of different, as an engineer, I guess in the late 2000s when extreme programming was big and the Agile Manifesto and all that, I definitely have gone all the way, one way with that stuff. And then, swung all the way back in other places. And I would say that for quite a while now, my approach has been to sort of cherry pick what works for each team, each situation, and continually check in and iterate on that process. I think, especially where I am now, which is a small company, I'm very wary of implementing too much process, or a process that ends up getting in the way rather than helping and reducing friction. So I would say that with that, I just try to adapt. And then similarly with my people management style, I would say I tend to be fairly adaptive in that, because different people need different things.
So one of the things I have observed about a lot of the writing and materials on leadership is that there's a lot of materials for frontline managers. There's some for like engineering leaders, but there's not very much at all for directors. And there's not a lot about like the transitions between the phases. There's some, but I guess I'm kind of curious what those different steps were like for you, and if you have any sort of like advice for people navigating those steps.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'll start just briefly with my move from being an engineer to a manager, and that happened at New Relic. And, I had put a lot of thought into it before then. I interviewed everybody at the company who had made that transition at the company. I talked to a lot of managers, and I feel like by the time I made that move, I had like a really good sense of what to expect. But even though I had that intellectually, like all these things are, once I got into it, it was still sort of a surprise, So for me, I think one of my biggest surprises there was just how differently motivated people are. I guess, again, that's something I knew intellectually, but still internally felt like, well, probably everybody approaches things or wants things, for the same reasons that I do. And they very much turned out not to be the case once I had engineers reporting to me, and I was helping them work towards their goals. The other thing that surprised me, I guess, was just being in the conversations now with other managers and directors and so forth about engineers, and sort of the necessarily candid conversations that happen there about performance and other such things. And that was, it wasn't like too jarring or anything, but it was, again, just sort of like a realization and a little bit surprising. I'd say when I made the move from manager to director, some of the things that I had to get used to or that surprised me were being like one more step removed from the engineers. So as a manager, of course, you are removed, well, depending on what kind of manager you are, but where I worked, the places that I worked, engineering managers did not code production projects. They weren't in the critical path. And so, you're removed from the hands-on work the engineers are doing, but you're still working with the engineers. You're still involved in the projects day to day. And so even though that was a transition from being an engineer to a manager, I feel like it was a bigger transition going from manager to director to then be that much further removed, where, then most of the information I'm getting is secondhand, I guess, like from my managers, or what I can glean from, the tools that we have for project tracking and status updates and so forth. And it was interesting to find myself in the position that probably everybody does when they're there, of having to sort of, be able to speak to those projects, be able to speak to the decisions being made while, being removed from them, and maybe not feeling 100% confident that I know for sure what's happening. So that was a big transition. And the other thing to get used to, I think, was similarly to when I made the transition to manager, and now suddenly being in a different level of conversations. When I became a director, that happened again, where now, the conversations that we would be having, with my VP of engineering and other directors, was not just about engineers, but about managers and about strategy across the engineering org, and about sort of these larger larger topics than you really get exposed to typically as a manager. So yeah, that was also again not something that maybe should have been a surprise, but it was just something that it took a little bit to get used to. Um, and then my transition to VP of engineering, like I said before, it's not going to be the same as everybody's transition because I went from being a director at a larger company to VP of engineering at a smaller company. And so, I think I spoke about this a bit before, but in my particular role, it's interesting to go sort of in both directions with this transition where, suddenly I am actually closer to the engineers and the work that they're doing and more like a manager in that way. But also I'm sort of having conversations that would be, potentially above my pay grade as a director of engineering, and being involved in decisions and strategic, conversations at that level.
A really nice summary. I have gone through very similar transitions myself, and so this all sounds very familiar.
Yeah.
Especially the director level, like that feeling of kind of disorientation where it's like, wow, there's kind of like this information void that I had to fill in, and that sense of discomfort with how much it's almost like I it was almost like I probabilistically understood things. I mostly did, but not completely. And I think what you talk about with the move to head of engineering it might be fairly common. I went through a very similar experience because often you go to a slightly smaller organization when you move up because it's kind of comparable in terms of complexity and so on. And so often they are recruiting people from slightly larger companies.
Yeah. Yeah. So, makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing, actually, as I'm reflecting on my move from manager to director, one thing that I appreciated was that in my time as director, I did feel like I kept learning, like I kept having new experiences that I wouldn't have had as a manager. And those things that, included sort of being involved with hiring at a different level than just like being a manager and hiring specifically for my team. So being involved in hiring decisions and so forth at that level. And during my time at Netlify, we had a big reorg. And so again, that was something that the other, sort of engineering directors and I were very involved in and led. And so that was a big project, both in terms of figuring out the reorg, but also the change management, the rollout, the communication, and all that. And then another thing that and I think that some managers deal with this, but I never did as a manager, was dealing with vendors, choosing vendors, going through that whole like procurement process and signing contracts and all of that was just, not like, I don't know, maybe not challenging, but it was a new thing for me. And all of those pieces, of course, like transfer pretty directly to my role now.
I think the last question I have for today is, do you have any advice for other people that are considering being a VP of engineering or head of engineering? When you look back at your career, do you have anything that you'd like to pass on to other people?
Yeah. So I think actually, if I go back to when I was an engineer thinking about becoming a manager, one of the things that that was said over and over at New Relic, and that the leadership there reiterated and the culture reinforced, was that going from being an engineer to being a manager is not a promotion. It's a different role. It's a different track. You have you're all still working towards the same goal. You just have different roles. And so, I really took that to heart when I moved onto the management track and became a manager there. And I'd say that at Netlify, when I moved from being a manager to being a director, I viewed it the same way, which is this is not, it is not that like somehow I'm just a better manager or whatever, because I'm such a good manager, I should be the director. That's not how that works. It's a different role. And so similarly, I'm working with, all my peers and all of my managers and engineers all towards the same goal, but I have a specific role. And in that role, I can have, a larger impact. So I guess I would say that I view being head of engineering in a similar way. I mean, of course, yes, like there are, decisions that I make have an impact for the whole organization. But that is my role. And hopefully that helps the organization just as any other role in the organization, helps us move forward. So yeah, I think that, as you are looking towards sort of what that next career step would be, it's helpful to really think about how that role is different than your current role. It's not just your current role plus plus. And think about like whether that is that something that interests you, that you want to learn, that you want to stretch yourself to be able to do this new role. And if so, then, I'd say go for it.
I really love how you describe that, because it really did feel like engineering manager felt like a different job than engineer. Director felt like a totally different job in a way that I did not expect at all from being a manager, and being VP of engineering or head of engineering. That was also a very different job. And so almost evaluating it as a career change that has some side benefits of, greater salary and perhaps greater influence. But it's much more about like, do you want that job, and what are you going to learn from that job, or what will the benefits be of it?
Yeah.
That really resonates with me. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that I'll say is like, so far my career, certainly on paper, is very linear from being an engineer to being a manager to a director to a VP of engineering, but it doesn't need to be that way. And I don't think it necessarily will be in the future. I think that I have enjoyed all of the roles that I've had. And, I think there are pros and cons to each.
Seth, this has been such a delight. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Jade. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Decoding Leadership. As always, I welcome your questions and feedback. And if you're looking for coaching or advisory help, you can contact me at rubik.com. See you next time.